Hey Alok, welcome to 100x Live. Good evening, audience. Today we have Alok Goyal, partner at Stellaris Venture Partner, an early stage technology based venture capital firm based out of Bangalore. And we are going to talk about fundamentals of scaling startups. And who better than Alok to help us understand that? Today, while all startups want to grow very fast, but there is a difference between growing rapidly and scaling up, right? And let's understand and hear Alok on how to develop a scale-up plan and what's the way that venture capital can help you scale up your business. So let me just give you a brief about Alok. Alok focuses his investments on enterprise software, logistics, automotive companies, and on behalf of Stellaris, Alok is on board of Whatfix, Noticeboard, Loadshare, Signkey, and lots of other companies. And he's also an independent director at eClerks, which is a public listed entity. So welcome, Alok, to 100x Live. Thank you so much for giving your valuable time. And if I may start with my first question, what would be your opening remarks? What's happening in the venture capital industry at the moment?
So, Sanjay, first of all, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be on this show, and a very warm welcome to everybody in the audience also. So, Sanjay, to your first question, I think if I have to be honest, it is a moment of uncertainty. Um, in general, I think running a startup is actually like sitting on the wheels of a car on a racetrack, which you are driving at 200 kilometers per hour or maybe even faster because that is what people expect out of you. But imagine doing it when there is a lot of fog all around you. And I think that's a situation we are finding ourselves in as an industry at the moment, whether it is the startups or whether it is the venture capital industry as well, that there is just a ton of uncertainty. I think whatever data demand characteristics that we are also getting, I think it's just very hard to interpret that data because one doesn't know what's going to happen 1 month later or 3 months later. So in that sense, I will say that it is tough times. And I will also argue that there is certainly a bit of a slowdown that we are seeing in the industry. And that has nothing to do with the availability of dry powder. I think that is just to do with the level of uncertainty that is there in the environment at the moment.
Great for that insights, Alok. But I mean, people are talking about that COVID-19 crisis is helping startups because the cost of customer acquisition is going down, and COVID is helping rapid adoption of technology. What's your view? Is COVID-19 really helping startups?
Good question, Sanjay. I think depending on who you talk to or what data you see, the answer will be actually very different. On one hand, as you will see that if you look at the big tech companies globally, particularly the biggest ones in the US, you see that their stocks are at their highest levels. And that seems to suggest that demand for technology in general should be very strong at this point in time. And that demand for technology should be rubbing off for startups as well. That being said, I would say that at least my generic answer is that no, I don't think it's a good thing for startups, barring a few sectors. So there are certain sectors where it was taking a bit of a time for trials to happen at a reasonable scale. So when you think about, let's say, telemedicine as an industry or remote education as an industry, all the technologies which are associated with work from home, whether that is collaboration, whether that is, let's say, VDI, security, those kinds of sectors clearly are getting a big fillip in this process. So there is certainly tailwinds for those sectors. But at a generic level, I don't think that is the case. Because if you look at what's happened because of COVID, we are probably witnessing the single largest contraction in our GDP ever since we have become independent. And whenever there is such a massive contraction, it is going to lead to at least certain level of changes in the buying sentiment of consumers, whether that's individual retail consumers or whether that's actually enterprises. And one way or the other, I think it is going to hurt. So at least my view is that it is actually going to be net hurtful for most startups in this situation, barring a few sectors where we might be witnessing some tailwinds. And I think it is also too early to answer the question, Sanjay, in some ways, because we are only 3 months into this crisis. And it's not just the COVID crisis, but it's the economic crisis that may follow the COVID crisis. And just predicting the shape of this curve, I think is going to be very hard.
True, very true. So there you hear an honest answer from a venture capitalist saying that, it's not all that great, and we need to be really, really conscious about which sectors we are into and plan our business accordingly. That's a great answer, Alok. Let's get into the topic of fundamentals of scaling startup, right? What do you mean by startup scaling, right? What's your view on startup scaling?
So it's a great question, Sanjay. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I have the best answers for it either. Like you said at the beginning of this entire podcast, that sometimes just people tend to use the word growth and scalability actually quite interchangeably. In my books, though, it is actually quite different. Scalability is, in general, the notion that whenever producing the next item or selling the next item or next unit costs you lower than the previous one, that actually is what I, at least in my books, define as scalability. So that means that getting the next $1,000 or the next $1 million should actually cost you lesser than the previous one did. And it can also be applied to individual function. So it can be applied to the scalability of customer acquisition engine. It can be applied to the scalability of the customer success function. So it can be applied at a functional level or at a company level. But the notion is that as you grow, what you do should become easier than what you did in the past. At least in my books, that's the basic definition of scalability.
Sure. So what's your view on bootstrap startups, right, which are doing across, how different it is when it gets venture? So usually scaling up is associated with venture capital. So how different it is with bootstrap startup? What's your view over there?
So at least in my books, again, there is no difference between bootstrap startups or funded startup. I think what matters is the following, that there are certain kinds of companies where for a certain period, as they grow, there is actually a negative contribution margin, which means that as you acquire one more customer, you actually lose money with every additional customer as opposed to making money with every additional customer. And by the way, it doesn't mean that business is necessarily bad. And there are plenty of those businesses around us as well. But in those kind of situations, to be able to grow, you do need to have cash in the bank. And since you are not generating cash, there is no accrual, and you can't fund your growth through internal accruals. You will need external cash, and therefore those will, by definition, need to be funded. And if I may take an example, let's take Facebook as a company. Until you reach a certain scale, it's very difficult to monetize your audience in a content business. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to scale. And as you scale, if you look at their customer acquisition engine, which began at a university level, but they very quickly figured out how to replicate from one university to another university. That kind of scalability they achieved, but they needed cash to be able to grow. So it can be funded, it can be unfunded. I think in India, we have seen some great examples too. If I think about Zoho as a company, or if I think of Browser Stack as a company, some of these companies have actually achieved pretty meaningful scale. And I know I am also using the word growth and scalability here interchangeably, but I think these companies have witnessed scalability without actually raising external capital. So I think it just depends on the kind of company. Some companies have a very natural scalability. So again, let's take an example. If you happen to be, again, a software company, and again, since I do a lot of SaaS, I naturally veer towards SaaS example. To build a software that you sell to your first customer, there is a very high product development cost. But when you sell the same software to a second customer, the additional variable cost is very low. So at least you see that on the, if I may call it, manufacturing of software is immensely scalable from a supply side perspective. On the other hand, if this were to be a logistics business, it's not as scalable on the supply side. So there are some inherent differences that will exist between different sectors. But the goal always is to be able to make sure that the next dollar costs you lesser than the previous dollar. And that applies to both.
Example of Zerodha has been phenomenal in that sense. Zerodha has been scaling up so rapidly.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely,
So, but
absolutely.
those exceptions are very few. But definitely there are exceptions in this case. Now let's move forward. Alok, what would be your recommendation? What are the do's and don'ts while scaling up a startup? What are the things that a startup founder should be doing and should not be doing? Right, and both are important. So, can you share some light on that?
I don't know how much time we have, Sanjay. This is one of my
No, so
favorite.
this is I have time. It's all about your time. So we have blocked your 45 minutes. So
Yeah.
hopefully we will have enough, viewership to enjoy your conversation.
So again, Sanjay, I don't know if there is a unique recipe, but I'll certainly go through my thoughts on what are the do's and don'ts of
Sure.
scaling. So I think, at least for me, the first rule is when not to scale. And in general, I would say that until you have figured out a product market fit, one should not be actually worrying about scalability. And I know there are lots of definitions of what does product market fit itself mean. In my books, it is about finding a customer segment, finding a problem for that customer segment, building a solution for it, and making sure that your solution actually really does solve that problem and therefore creates value for that customer. And until you really ascertain that you have achieved that point, you don't want to be putting more fuel to the fire, because you may be actually putting more fuel to the wrong fire in that situation. And there is no one unique recipe to be able to figure out whether that product market fit has been achieved or not. But varieties of indicators will lead you to figure that out, whether it's the stickiness of your cohorts, whether that's about level of organic growth that you are able to achieve. If it's an enterprise business, that might be about lower churn. So there are lots of different ways in which you can ascertain that, but that's one way to figure out. The other thing which I'll also add in the same breath is that very often I find entrepreneurs who will say that, look, I'm building this because I will monetize it this way later. And let's, for the sake of discussion, put it as part one and part two. And very often people see growth in part one, but they are actually not really testing whether they will be able to monetize it or not. And different businesses will have different beat, but I would argue that for those businesses where that monetization can be tested early, until that monetization is tested, I actually don't think you have achieved product market fit. So if I'm buying something for 100 rupees and selling it for 80, and I'm seeing there are lots of people coming and buying it, I actually, in my books, that's not product market fit. So I think that basic unit economics also needs to ascertain. So that's rule number one. Rule number two is that even after you do find the product market fit, which is you know that what's the problem and you have a solution to it, you have to figure out how to take it to market, which is also pretty non-trivial, and which often involves figuring out the early adopters, the channels to reach those early adopters, figuring out what is the cost of acquisition of a customer, what can be the likely lifetime value of these customers. Essentially, your goal is that you are trying to figure out that, look, can I acquire these customers profitably or not? And in the industry parlance, we will say that the lifetime value of the customer, LTV, needs to be more than the CAC. As long as that is true, you have figured out a viable way to acquire the customers. So that's the next step that you need to ascertain. And therefore, that ties into my rule number three, which is that if you have found a product market fit and if you have found a go to market fit, at that point, if you are not putting your foot on the pedal, then I think that is also criminal as an entrepreneur. So while you should be cautious until that time, but once you do find those fit, you should be actually now putting your foot on the pedal. At that stage, what I find is that most of the scalability questions end up relating more often than not to people. And it's about how you scale the organization or build the organization that determines the underlying scalability. And there are multiple, I guess, do's or don'ts. And if I may run through some of those, Sanjay.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So the first one is that when you typically begin a company, you begin with a set of generalists. In fact, most founders or co-founders are usually generalists. They don't say that, okay, I will only think about the product, or I'll only think about sales, or I'll only think about customer service, etc. They do whatever it takes. They're problem solvers. They're very flexible. They're very adaptable, and they're very action oriented. But as an organization grows, one finds a transition from generalist to specialist. And I think founders or CEOs need to keep that in mind, that what they look for in hiring actually changes. It's one thing to, let's say, have a co-founder or an initial hire do customer success. But as that function begins to grow, you begin to look for specialists who know exactly how to do it. So that's transition number one, which is generalist to a specialist. The second thing is, again, that as an organization grows, a CEO should be able to bucket people into three different buckets. There are builders, or rather I would say creators, and these are people who can create new things. Let's say you are at some stage of the company and you need to build an organization or a go-to-market motion for a channel-led sales that you have not done in the past. That again requires an entrepreneur-like thinking, and those are the creators. Then there are second ones, which are not necessarily creators, but they grow. So once there is a seed, they know how to make that seed into a plant. And then there is a third bucket, which take a larger function and know how to optimize. They are very process oriented. They can extract the last bit of juice in optimizing things. So while in general we think of people within multiple functions, we say, oh, this is a marketing guy, or this is a saleswoman. But we should also think of people between these three buckets, which are creators, growers, and optimizers, I would say. And make sure that we are able to use the right set of talent into the right thing, depending on the stage that particular function is in the company at that point in time. So that's number two. Number three, which is, I think, very hard for a founder to do, is to, again, I'm going to relate to the Peter Principle, which came out in 1969, which is the famous statement that everybody rises to their point of incompetence in an organization. And that holds true also for a startup. I don't think there is anything different. In fact, if at all, it happens faster in a startup, because a startup may be doubling, tripling, quadrupling, sometimes even 10x in a single year. And therefore, we often find that if you have a management team, every 12 months or 24 months, you may find that half the people in that management team are actually not fit to be on the management team any longer. Because, and in general, my thumb rule is maybe half will scale or learn how to scale, and the other half actually will find that they're not able to scale. And as a CEO, you need to have a very sharp eye in figuring out who is able to transition, who is not able to transition. And those who are not able to transition, they either need to find new roles, which are not necessarily at the management team level, or they need to be let go. And I think that is a very hard thing to do, because you are dealing with people who are loyal to you so far, and you feel a bit guilty. But I think that's an important task that a CEO needs to do all the time. The related thing, if I may say, as a corollary to that, is that not to hire for yesterday, but to hire for tomorrow. And again, Sanjay, because I love SaaS companies, I'm going to take an example there. In the early stages, you find that a SaaS company grows 3 to 5x for at least a few years. So it's very common that in a 2-year time frame, you might find that a SaaS company is 10x of where it is. Now, let's assume that you're looking for a head of sales. Now, you don't want to look for a head of sales for the current scale of the company. Chances are, by the time you find someone, it can actually be 3 to 6 months quite easily. By the time they really get ramped up and begin to perform, it usually takes another 6 months. Now you want this person to stay for a few years and actually contribute. So if you think about the contribution that that person has to make 24 months out, they need to be able to handle 10x the scale from the point where you thought about hiring someone. And that's the point I made about hiring somebody for tomorrow and not for yesterday. Very often we try to hire people to solve yesterday's problems, but those are tactical hires. As you think about your strategic hires, they need to be 12 to 24 months out. So you need to adopt that lens in hiring people. Yet another one, and which is not a very popular statement to make, but they often say that you have never fired anybody too soon. And in general, the saying is that in the first 90 days, you know whether somebody is going to work out or not work out. And it may sound a bit heartless, but I think part of a CEO's job is to be able to figure out who is not working out, especially if it's a cultural misfit sooner rather than later. But even from a performance perspective, I think you always have a gut. Very often we are fighting our own gut and giving a benefit of doubt. I at least find that most of these benefit of doubts actually don't really work out. And you're better off letting people go than keeping dead weight on the organization. And sorry, I have two more, which I'm going to run through, Sanjay.
No, please. Interesting. I'll just pause here, and you got so much fan following now coming. People are writing and commenting on your answers. Please continue.
Yeah. The last one on the people front, I was going to say, Sanjay, is that I think the hardest thing in scaling the company that the founder CEO will face is sometimes trying to figure out when their co-founders have run out of steam as well. So while this applies to the rest of the management team, let's say you're three co-founders, the reality is that at some point in the growth of the company, you will reach a point where one of the co-founders will also not be relevant. And that is a very hard one to deal with because it's going to be a touchy topic. It's going to disturb the dynamics of the company. There, I think the founder, CEO, the board, all of the people need to be mature, need to be wise, and need to figure out a very respectful way in which these co-founder transitions can be made themselves. So I've seen many of these transitions being made. In some cases, these have been done, I would say, in a very mature way, but in some cases, it doesn't happen in all that mature way. So net, as you will see, the bulk of this list relates to people. But I will add one last thing to this thing, which is that I think building a company is such a long job. I, in general, think that building a real company takes 8 to 10 years. Nothing happens in a hurry. In fact, nothing good happens in a hurry. And therefore, during that period, there will be plenty of situations where things are not working as you think they should have. And therefore, being in founder shoes is very difficult because you have to play the cheerleader to people all the time. Everybody's reading your body language all the time. So it's very difficult to be honest with the entire organization all the time for you. And I would take current example, the COVID situation is actually one of those situations too. And therefore, I always recommend to all founders that they need to find one or two mentors with whom they can confide. These are people who will not be judgmental. These are people who are on their side. These are people who have seen this path in the past. They can empathize with founders, and founders can actually truly feel free to be vulnerable in front of them and share what they're seeing, because getting some of those sounding boards is very critical as we run through this long journey. And I will sort of shoot myself in the foot while saying so, which is that very often I find that board members are not the best people to occupy this position. I think it needs to be someone who truly is in a non-judgmental situation.
So, Alok, that brings me to my point. You said it's more of a people setup, in people focus, which needs to be there. Where do you see venture capital playing a role in scaling up?
So capital plays a very critical role, Sanjay, in this entire process, of course, as I talked about, because very often you find, if I go back to one of the statements I made, which is that there are many companies which are able to find a product market fit. They're sometimes able to figure out a go-to-market fit also. But even when you find so again, I'm going to take a SaaS example again. Sure. It's very common that it takes about 1 year for a typical salesperson, particularly if it's mid-market or enterprise, to ramp up to full productivity. Which means that you are actually incurring the expense of ramping up your sales team. But the bang per buck for that investment comes a little bit later. Sure. Even though LTV may be more than the CAC eventually, but there is a cash outflow, which is the cost of growing that you're paying in the process. In certain kinds of businesses, let's take logistics, there's always working capital involved. It's very common to have 45, 60-day working capital cycles. So the more you grow, the more capital gets blocked. So I think venture capital plays a very critical role in this process. That without capital, you are actually not able to put your foot on the accelerator. And that's where I do think that the role of venture capital becomes very critical.
Sure. So, Alok, we are I'm just trying to pick up a couple of questions which has come. The first one, Abhishek is asking, what are your views on travel content startups and its scalability? Any views over here?
So, Abhishek, I'm no expert in travel. I'll confess that one of my colleagues actually does investment, but I will give at least a generic answer, which is that if you look at the current times, the existing models clearly are going to face a lot of headwind because people are not traveling. I think that's the reality. Whether you're a large player or you're a small player, I think pretty much most travel startups are finding themselves into a headwind situation as opposed to a tailwind situation. So, that being said, people will have to figure out why people travel in the first place. So there are those which were traveling because of business and those that were traveling because of pleasure. And I think we may all need to figure out different ways of creating offerings which can be relevant for users. I'll take one example in our portfolio, a company called Vogo, which is in the travel space, travel and transportation space, because they are enabling people to travel on these point-to-point rentals of scooters. Now, during COVID cycle, we know that lesser people are traveling in the first place. They have created newer offerings. So they know that people don't want to exchange vehicles from other travelers multiple times in a day because they are worried that if somebody else has touched the scooter, I don't want to touch the same scooter. So suddenly models like daily rentals, weekly rentals, or even monthly rentals have become far more popular. And these are offerings that did not exist in the pre-COVID situation. So we all have to think on our feet to figure out newer offerings that address the customer problems. And the offerings we had in the past may not actually work out.
Sure. So, second question, which I want to pick up is, as a SaaS model has shot up, how do you see IoT hardware startup using PaaS model for scaling up? Do you have any view over here?
So Sanjay, I have evaluated a lot of IoT hardware, IoT startups from India. Over the last 7 years, I don't have a figure in mind, but I would not be surprised if it's at least 100 to 200 startups that I have evaluated in the IoT space. A few comments. Number one is that, is there massive opportunity in the IoT space? The answer is obviously yes. I think just the fact that we can make so many different points or objects connected to the internet, and as opposed to humans trying to check on them repeatedly, the fact that these different nodes or junctions can actually speak for themselves can create massive opportunity. Take industrial IoT as an example. If you look at the whole area of reactive and preventive maintenance, it has been so inefficient for ages, for decades. And IoT can add tremendous value to that entire process. That said, I do find that hardware-oriented startups face certain different kinds of challenges than other kinds of spaces find, because in general, iteration of hardware is actually a more difficult process than iteration of software. It is not about correcting a bug and releasing it tomorrow. Every cycle of hardware actually goes through a very different process. India in general has not had a very good hardware ecosystem. We are certainly not at the class of China when it comes to hardware ecosystem. So this is not to say that there isn't an opportunity, and whether successful startups from India will come out or not. I think plenty of successful startups, I'm sure, will come out. But I would say that, at least in my experience, it's been a harder bet to take compared to software.
Gotcha. Any views here? One more question from Virendra. Your views on edtech post-COVID, pure online hybrid. Do you have any view on edtech startups?
So I think edtech is one of the sectors which is going to benefit the most in this crisis, if I may use that word. And I'm actually personally very, very bullish on this space, and I'll tell you why. I actually don't find that much difference in the way education happens or teaching happens compared to when I studied 30, 40 years back. And if I compare that to how my children are studying today, yes, they go to school in a better school bus. Their classes have ACs, which we never had. They have better benches. They have fancier books. And they all speak in English, which we didn't know how to speak in, at least when I went to school. But the actual pedagogy has not changed that materially. I still think that there is a lot of rote learning. So, in my view, that whole notion of experiential learning, that whole notion of creating different pace for every child and every student, a lot of those things actually technology can enable. But in general, making those interventions has been very hard because the core of education, which is the K through 12, has actually been very stubborn. It has also been very regulated. But COVID is actually giving an opportunity to do I guess, the biggest mass scale trial that we can. And Sanjay, you use the word hybrid. I do think that hybrid models can make a lot of difference because education is not just about, I guess, pure learning only. I think there's a lot of social aspect to this as well. And to a certain extent, there is a bit of a contact sport in learning also. So I do think that there will be hybrid models that will come. And COVID is going to create a lot of acceptability to use of technology, which I think never really existed. And technology was only playing on the fringes. So I'm very bullish on this space.
Sure. So we got one more question which I mentioned, brought up on the screen, Alok. Is advice for founders who have received a term sheet pre-COVID and VCs have taken a pause once COVID is struck. Any comments on this? What should be the founder doing across?
Boy, this is a tough one. I think this is a really tough one because I think to begin with, it is unethical. So I don't think it's a done thing because even though we all say that term sheets are not binding, but the reason we all get that piece of paper signed by everyone is because we do believe that our word and our commitment does hold some value. And once we have agreed on that piece of paper, unless we are finding something material in the due diligence, the financial and the legal due diligence, I do believe that it is incumbent upon all of us to abide by that term sheet and not renege on that. That being said, I'm sure like many people on the call, have I heard of instances where term sheets have been pulled back? I have heard of those. I don't think there is any way to defend that situation. I also think that it puts the entrepreneur in a very, very tough spot because usually when you go to market when you have 6 months of capital left, or I don't know, sometimes even 4 months of capital left. You get a term sheet, you stop shopping for money at that point in time. And if a month later the investor tells you that I'm pulling back, then you really are putting the company at the risk of an existential crisis at that point in time. So I don't have a magic bullet for this one. I think this question is from Sanjay. Sanjay, in that situation, I guess your priority is to figure out how to save the company, how to get some money in there. If it means that you have to renegotiate the term, I think one has to sort of suck up and one has to just do it. If it means that you have to find some bridge money from your existing investors, I guess that's what one has to do. So if that may also mean that you have to cut costs dramatically, I think you may need to do that also. But usually it's a combination of all those factors, but there are no easy answers. And I think you also have to appeal to the...
I have a flurry of questions.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, I was saying I've got flurry of questions coming from Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. So I think I'll quickly jump onto my question. Otherwise, it will remain unanswered for me itself. So can you just share across some transformational journey of scaling up within your portfolio companies, right? You've been successful with a lot of your B2B startups, and what were those transformational journey? How did you help these startups become successful?
So maybe Sanjay, I'll take an example which one is close to my heart, and I think you are aware of the company as well. A company called WhatFix.
Sure.
For the listeners, I'll just talk about what it does. So WhatFix is a company it's a SaaS company whose software helps with the digital adoption of other enterprise software. So let's say you have just deployed Workday or Salesforce and you have thousands of users, then onboarding, training, and ongoing support of users on Salesforce has also become complicated today because these softwares have become very complicated. And the best way to think about this is like a Google map of applications, which is that let's say you are within SAP and you say, how do I do this? As opposed to reading an article, it will give you a click by click walkthrough as you do that transaction that you wanted to do. So that's what the company does. To give some more context, this is a company I met for the first time back in 2014 when I was part of Helion Ventures. And I was actually quite negative on the concept itself because I thought that software is becoming more and more easy to use. There's a lot of design thinking that is coming into software. So the whole notion of support and onboarding needs to go down. Self-serve needs to come up. And therefore, this is a sunset industry as opposed to sunrise. So I will confess that first of all, I even refused to meet the team. But I'll fast forward. At one point, I did meet them. Once I did meet them and I saw their demo, within 3 days, I wrote them a term sheet. It's the fastest term sheet I have ever written in my career. If I look at that company, I guess like any company, they have had to go through multiple transformations. And I will touch upon at least 2 or 3 major transformations that they have gone through. So this is a company that used to sell to very small entities. And at one point, their what we call the annual contract value or the ACV used to be as small as $1,000 to $2,000. And they found that in that segment, there is very high churn. It's very hard to expand the size of the customers. During a couple of years, they went through a massive transformation from SMBs to large enterprise. I don't have the exact numbers, but if I'm not mistaken, they have somewhere between 100 to 200 Fortune 1000 customers today. They do so many $100,000 plus deals today. And that transformation has been a very non-trivial transformation for Whatfix to take. I will also take one more associated transformation, which is the company was entirely built out of Bangalore. Everybody, all the founders, all the sales, product development, everything was sitting out of India. And gradually we are seeing the center of gravity of the company shift to US. But like that, there are 5 or 6, I would say, major transformations that they have gone through in their journey. And I think different founders will find different recipes. But the one thing that I find, Khadem and Vara, these are the 2 founders of the company, I find that they do repeatedly very well, is that at every stage of the company, they're very good at identifying what's the problem they need to solve if they have to, quote unquote, transform themselves. And more often than not, they don't have the answers for it, but they know what the problem is. But what they do repeatedly very well is to figure out who are the 5 or 6 people to reach out to solve that problem. So they listen to people. They are able to triangulate as to what could be the 1 or 2 or 3 different approaches of solving that problem. They're very good at doing A/B testing with these solutions. And then in the end, they are good at killing what doesn't work and scaling that works. And they have followed this, I would say, process of problem solving repeatedly across so many different transitions or transformations they have done. And I find that to be an amazing skill for the founders to have. Because I do think that nobody is so smart that they have all the answers. But knowing the process of solving these problems is sometimes the how is more important than the what, at least in my books.
No, fantastic. I mean, Whatfix is my NT portfolio. I missed out that deal, so congratulations on with Whatfix, and Kadim is a great founder. Alok, if I have to understand your investment thesis, how do you evaluate deals? And I would like to club another question: how is Stellaris as a VC different from other VCs, and what is that unique proposition which you offer to startup founders from your VC fund? So, what's your investment thesis, and how do you differentiate Stellaris?
Okay, maybe the first one, neither is an easy question, but how do I evaluate deals? I think the first confession is that I think venture capital is a profession where you're always an apprentice. I don't think there's a point in time when you have figured out the art, because the art is also constantly changing. When I began in this profession, at least at that point, I used to believe that the only thing that one needs to really pay focus on is the entrepreneur, and not as much as on the market. So I'll at least say that the one lens I've changed over the years is that I have begun to believe that market is at least as important as getting the team right. And maybe I'll go back to a conversation I was having with someone on Friday. This is actually a very good founder who has built 2 companies and sold 2 companies. And now he's doing his 3rd startup. And he said to me that, Alok, that no matter how great an entrepreneur is, an entrepreneur cannot fight the market. And therefore, I do believe that getting the market right is important. And when I use the word market, I'm actually not trying to say what is the TAM necessarily, but it needs to be a deep enough problem, and it needs to be something where the entrepreneur is bringing a reasonable enough insight to solve that problem. So I do find that at least the right market is as important as the entrepreneur. But the second piece I'll say is that in our industry, it's also very difficult to figure out how do you say whether somebody is a right entrepreneur or a team to back. And at least I find that I don't have any magic recipe to that either. I find that our job as investors is to find a spike that the team brings. We will not know upfront what that spike is, but we need to figure out what that spike is. That spike can be building teams, that spike can be selling, that spike can be product thinking, that spike can be just sort of deep technical skill. There can be very many different spikes that are possible, but that spike better be a spike to a point that it can negate a lot of the other challenges that the entrepreneur or the team might have. But we need to figure out what that spike is. So at least I don't go into situations with a preconceived notion on what do I need to look for in the entrepreneur. So that's the first piece to your answer. What is it that we do differently? See, I think in our business, no matter which VC you talk to, at some level, we have the same strategy. We are trying to get access to the best entrepreneurs, trying to enter the company as early as we can, and therefore, with as little money, we want to get as much equity as we can so that we can maximize our returns. And even post our first investments, our strategy is that we want to put a lot more money behind the companies that we think can be winners, and not expose too much money behind companies that we don't think are going to generate the return. So at least at a strategy level, it's very hard for me to argue that there is something fundamentally different about Stellaris. I do think that ours is a business where differentiation is created more in the execution than in the strategy itself. Okay. And if I may be a bit immodest and talk about a few things that I at least believe are differentiators for Stellaris. Number one is that Stellaris itself has been created by people who have been operators themselves. Not all of us are entrepreneurs, but we have all built businesses. So if I look at across the team, one of my colleagues actually built a business which was $40 million P&L, global P&L for a large software company. Another colleague of mine tried building a startup himself and was in the enterprise product management space for a long time.
I know you from your SAP days. So
sorry?
I know you from your SAP days. So in that sense,
I mean, I had the opportunity to grow a P&L from $100 million to $500 million for a software company. Some of us have been entrepreneurs in the past as well. So at least we do believe that those operating backgrounds do give a certain, one is empathy, and I think also a little bit of a more practical lens in terms of how companies are built. So at least we believe that we are able to become better partners for entrepreneurs post-investment as well. That's number one. Number two is that Stellaris, when it was founded itself, there are actually a large number of very successful entrepreneurs and professionals who constitute a pretty large portion of as an LP for Stellaris itself. So 25% of our capital actually comes from this group of people who we call the Stellaris Founder Network. And I will just name a few people because they have given us permission to name them. Most others we actually don't name publicly. But if you look at people like Rajesh Yabaji of Blackbuck, Alok Mittal of Indifi, Neeraj Agarwal of BCG, who is the head of Asia Pacific for BCG, these are the kind of people who have invested behind us. And they are a very valuable source of advice to us and to our entrepreneurs. And they're also a very valuable source of deal flow for us as a firm as well. And I think that has been a very unique asset for us. The third one, which we are also actually often blamed for quite often, is we believe in taking bets when we are fully convinced. There is no half-baked bet for us. There is no option value check that we write. We never put money in something and say, it's a small amount of money for our fund. Let's put it. We will revisit this in the next round. If it's something worthwhile, then we'll put more money behind it. So that option value investing doesn't exist. And I would like to believe that we are an investor who don't borrow conviction from anybody else. We need to build our own conviction. It doesn't matter which brand in the business is investing behind a company. We actually, in some ways, don't care. If we believe in it, we'll invest. If we don't believe in it, we'll actually not write a check. And the last part I'll say is that we are very thesis driven as an investor. If you look at a bulk of our time where it is spent, it is actually spent on building thesis. And sometimes we can get very micro in building those theses as well. But we do believe that having certain educated point of view on sectors is important. That is not to say that we don't take any opportunistic bets at all. We do. But I would say a large bulk of our bets are spaces where we have actually built thesis in the past. And again, time will tell, Sanjay, whether these things that, first of all, I'm saying as differentiators, whether these truly are differentiators. And number two, even if they are, they lead to eventual success or not. We are a startup ourselves. We are only 4 years old ourselves. Sure. So we are a pretty young startup ourselves.
You are being modest, Alok, in that sense. Let's start a small rapid fire where you can quickly give us some answers. We have taken enough of your time. Sure. But if you can name 3 of your portfolio companies which you would see becoming Sunicons or unicorns, right? What would those be? 3 names.
Okay, I have to, since it's rapid fire, I know that I have to pick between our children here in some sense. Yes. But I would say 3 companies which I'll be very disappointed if they don't become a unicorn tomorrow will be Vortex, Mamaearth, and Loadshare.
And
Loadshare.
Okay, awesome.
Loadshare in the logistics space. This is not to say that others will not reach that milestone, but I would be hugely disappointed if these 3 don't reach that milestone.
Right. Any 3 books you would be able to recommend or blogs for startup founders they should read or follow?
So actually, I don't read much of business books, but I actually follow a lot of podcasts. And to begin with, I do follow 100x.vc quite intently. I've known you for a long time, Sanjay. And I know at least in the last 6-7 years, we have collaborated on multiple things. So that's something I follow actually pretty avidly. I also love the Masters of Scale podcast. And this is from the founder of LinkedIn. I like it because he chooses very unique entrepreneurs and goes into a lot of depth in figuring out what they did right and what they did not do right. And the third one, which actually is more a reading thing and a podcast also, 2 venture funds whose content I really like and admire. One is Andreessen. I like their podcast. And Bessemer, I really like their content. And I say this particularly because I'm a SaaS investor. If I think about the best cloud content, I think Bessemer takes it to a different form.
In fact, they have an page on their website for NT portfolios on the.
Exactly.
So that brings me, Alok, share any 2 examples of your NT portfolio. All of us have got many. I've got like tons in mine, but at least 2 names which you missed as a deal kind of stuff, which you saw and then you didn't invest.
The joke in our firm is that whenever anybody asks us our anti-portfolio question, we always say, how much time do you have? Because that list is pretty long. But, but let me pick two examples. And I truly do regret both of these quite a bit. First one is Mindtickle. It's a Pune-based company, and it's a SaaS company in the sales enablement space. And I've known the team before they even raised their seed funding.
Okay.
And SAP was actually one of their initial customers also. So I had some insider view to them, even at the time I met them first. I think it's an outstanding team. It's a great space. And I never had any doubt on those two. And the reason I did not do the deal, and I'm being open and confessing this, is that I always thought that the deal was a bit too expensive at every stage. And I evaluated it multiple times. And at least my learning in hindsight is, Sanjay, on this one, when you find a great space and a great team, be flexible on valuation. Don't spend time. Because if the company becomes really good, I think it'll adjust for those valuation differences that we thought were there in the beginning, number one. Number two is very current and hurts a lot, therefore, is Postman. I met the Postman team also actually at the pre-seed stage.
Oh.
And one of my colleagues actually was very gung-ho about the space and the team. And despite that, I did not pull the trigger on Postman. And I think two different reasons. Number one, I wish I had more technical chops for me to be able to understand better what they did. And number two, in our business, you put money because you're trying to imagine a world 5 to 10 years out. I just don't think I had enough imagination in my head to understand where the space will go in due course. And clearly history tells us that it's been a phenomenal asset and therefore part of the anti-portfolio.
That's awesome. What are the three sectors you follow and what's your favorite sectors? Three sectors.
So I'll say that so the three I spend my most time on. Number one is SaaS. Partly I just came from that background. Was more natural for me to pick it up. At Helion also, that's the space I was focusing on. And that's been the bulk of my investments. The second area is logistics. I started sort of dipping my toes into logistics back from 2015. It took me a while to actually write a check because that's a time during which we were doing fundraise for Solaris also. And invested in LoadShare at the end of 2017. But I like that space a lot. And the third one is electric vehicles, which I've been spending some time over the last 18 months, have come close to writing a check, not yet written one, but I'm very keenly following that space as
well. This is one question which is favorite for me, and I usually would have great answers from all my guests on 100x Live. What's your view on 100x.vc business model, being the first check, investor in the country?
So first of all, I think Sanjay, it's a fantastic initiative. I do believe that people who are ready to hold the hands of startups at the time they are truly born and do it genuinely, I think there are very few such people who do it. We have seen examples of some fantastic accelerators being created outside the country. And we know in hindsight how much value these have created. So I think it is great to see, I think what you have done, Sanjay, in creating 100x.vc. I think it's first of all a much needed space. What's I think also unique is that, again, since I've known you the most within that team, is that people who have been CIOs or operators in their own past, them doing this thing, I think makes a lot of difference to entrepreneurs. So kudos for doing this thing. And the last one, which I think is also very important, is that very early checks in our industry actually usually are not very fair to entrepreneurs, because usually these are written at very unfair valuations. If you look at US, all these early checks are written as convertible notes. They're not price runs because the entrepreneur does not have negotiation leverage at that stage. And not everybody is a Kunal Shah or a Mukesh Bansal to be able to get the right valuation for their first check. And I think therefore doing these as safe rounds, which is what you do as a philosophy, I think is a is a much needed reform, if I may use that word, in our industry.
Thank you so much. And then the closing note, we have taken a lot of your time, almost an hour. Closing note, any three things which startups can do in short term, any three items which you would like to recommend for startup founders that they can do it in short term?
So maybe first things first here, we all know that it's probably a tough environment, but I think these are the times, if I were to be an entrepreneur, number one is to remind yourself why you started this business and ask yourself, do you still believe in the problem you're solving or not? Because I would argue that if it's an 8 to 10 years journey to build any meaningful startup, such moments will come in any startup journey. Maybe you are encountering it too early or maybe midstream. But if you do believe in the problem, then believe in yourself. I think these are times to be optimistic from that situation. So don't give up just because there is COVID or any other headwind that you are facing. Number two, I think figure out ways to survive. I mean, to be able to fight the battles, you first have to be alive. So figure out a way that you can capitalize the company for the next 18 to 24 months. If that means you have to cut some cost. But I think figure out that path. And the third thing is that be prepared to take steps that you may need to do to be able to even alter the path that you need to be able to chart the course, and maybe even aware of there are certain ways in which the world might have even changed. So if you do need to pivot, I mean, again, the word in our industry is pivot, but if you do need to change the course, I think be prepared to change that course also. But again, I think number one is the most important. Just because the times are bad does not mean that you should not believe in yourself. I think these are the times that you need to just enhance your own belief in yourself.
So, Alok, lastly, if any startup founder has to reach out to Stellaris, to Alok Goyal, how does one reach out to Stellaris?
Actually, please do write to us. We are constantly looking to meet entrepreneurs. I think our reason for existence is to meet entrepreneurs. So please do reach out to us. You can just write an email to us. We are very easily reachable. alok@stellarisvc.com. vp.com, what am I saying? So just feel free to write to us, myself or any of my colleagues. Please do feel free.
On this positive note, thank you, Alok, for your time. It was amazing session, lot of learning for me. It was inspiring, and you got tons of comments on the question which remain unanswered. So audience, in case if you want to reach out, Alok has shared his email ID. Please reach out to him and work with Stellaris. It's a fantastic fund. And Alok, he's been doing great job. And thank you, Alok, for coming on 100x Live.
No, thank you. My pleasure, Sanjay, and really appreciate your inviting me on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.